So I would like to say good morning or good afternoon. Looking at the names that are here, I'm not sure which continent people are on. So good afternoon from here, good evening to our speaker and to others. Good morning if you're online from Asia. I'm Margie Mendell. I'm the director of the Karl Polanyi Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanikitake Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Totaka, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Thank you for attending today. Our session will be recorded for those who are unable to attend but who have registered. It really is a pleasure for me to have Gareth Dale with us. We'll introduce in a moment. This is not I wish it were, as we call it here, a 5 à 7, where we could raise our glasses and celebrate the new edition, the Penguin edition of the Great Transformation, but we will celebrate it in our way, virtually. And if it's around 5 o'clock your time, take a glass of bubbly or uh, claret, and we will drink our tea and perhaps raise a toast to the new edition of the Great Transformation before we finish our session today. I am aware that and I just verified with Gareth, I believe I should say that the new edition is now going into its fourth printing. And one of the questions I had asked Gareth, and I hope that he will speak to it when he begins in a couple of minutes, is how do we explain that? How do we explain this surge, this wonderful news that the book is going into its fourth printing? If some of you read the article, it was suggested that it was a discovery of Polanyi in the UK. That's hard to believe, given how much attention the Great Transformation has received really over the last 3 or 4 decades, and it's just been it's been accelerating internationally. So the question would be, do people have copies like mine, which are so marked up that it's good to have a nice new copy of the Great Transformation? Are there indeed new people who are discovering the Great Transformation only for a first time? So I would just like to have Garrett's perhaps thoughts on that question. I want to introduce Gareth to you. And looking at the names, many of you know Gareth. I asked him a moment ago, when was the first time that we met? When did he first come to the Institute to begin his extensive research? And it was either 2007 or 2008. And it was before the archive was digitized. So he came and spent weeks. And in fact, at one point, he was here for a month. And I remember him diligently entering the Institute early in the morning and leaving it late in the day, and sometimes in the evenings, meticulously going through the archive. The result of which has been numerous publications, and I'll mention just the books because there are also many articles. The first to come out was Karl Polanyi, published by Polanyi Press in 2010. Karl Polanyi, The Hungarian Writings, Manchester University Press, 2015. Reconstructing Karl Polanyi, Excavation and Critique, Pluto, 2016. Karl Polanyi, A Life on the Left, Columbia, 2016, which is really the most definitive intellectual biography of Karl Polanyi. Exploring the Thought of Karl Polanyi, Agenda 2019. And now he has written a superb introduction to the newly minted edition of the of the Great Transformation. And Gareth is a professor and associate head of the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Brunel University. Prior to Brunel, he was a professor at Birkbeck, LSE, Swansea University, and joined Birkbeck in 2005. He is also the director of the Sustainability Politics Research Lab at his university, and he is a member of the Polanyi Institute executive committee. I won't go on about his really important work that he's been doing over the last years on the environment, on ecology, on critique of the growth paradigm, but I just want to say that his work has been translated into so many languages, including Kazakh and Romanian, and Turkish, Ukrainian, and on and on. And prior to working on Polanyi, his work on East Europe and particularly Eastern Germany was also uh, highly recognized. In his introduction to the Great Transformation, he writes, and I'm just going to quote two passages here. Among the most powerful sections of the Great Transformation is Polanyi's analysis of the shuttling of strains between the political and economic spheres and the national and international scales, a tracing of the ways in which the various crises of the age, democracy, market society, international order, and world economy, interlaced, with each connection multiplying the intensity of the crisis as a whole. And then he ends his introduction with a comment on how we continue to hear echoes of the era in which Polanyi wrote as we explore the origins of our own contemporary cataclysms, plural, with the help of his book. Gareth, thank you for agreeing to be with us. It's a pleasure to see you on screen, and I turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thanks so much for these kind words and for the invitation to speak with you here. So, of course, it's always a pleasure to be connecting with people in the Polanyi Institute. I have so many fond memories of researching there with you in Montreal, with so much help from Anna and Margie and Karl. And it's also been a pleasure to have been involved in this new edition of the Great Transformation. And of course, I must give a special shout out to Kari Polanyi-Levitt. Kari can't be with us today, but I think she's going to be able to listen to the recording of it later on. So I hope you're well, Kari. We're all thinking of you, and I'm glad. I was so happy when you wrote to express your pleasure at the new edition of your father's book. And Hannah, who steered the book to publication over at Penguin Books, she wants especially to pass on her greetings to you too. Now, this new edition, the fact that it's Penguin is interesting, I think, in a way. I mean, Polanyi surely would have been quite a fan of the Penguin Project back then when Alan Lane set it up in 1930s England, just 2 years after Polanyi arrived here. So the Penguin legend is that Alan Lane, he went to visit Agatha Christie, and on his way home, he came through Exeter St. David's railway station, and he was looking at the reading material on the shelves there, and he was struck by just how limited its range and how shoddy its production, and so there and then he set out to create a range of bright, cheap, high quality books for the mass market. And the aim was to sell books in mass shops like Woolworths and not just in bookshops, because bookshops were seen as, they were in a sense zones of snobbery, not attractive to working people. And quality books ought to be available to the masses, and not only through libraries, but for their shelves as well. And so the Penguins in the 30s were priced at sixpence. Alan Lane famously put it, allegedly, so the story goes, he said, our books should be as easily and casually bought as a packet of cigarettes. I'm not sure if we put it in quite those words today, especially not at this meeting, recalling that Polanyi was a heavy smoker and he he died far too young of cancer. Anyway, an important other part of the penguin identity was its design. Um, and to this end, they used a font design by a very celebrated sculptor and graphic designer of the day, Eric Gill. His sans serif was used for the titles and the authors of the Penguin books, so they leap from the cover, so that hurried working people, commuters, and so on could quickly get the information that they needed before to work out which book to buy. Um, Penguin later changed the font to Times New Roman, which is a cardinal sin, of course. But anyway, Gill also is interesting, by the way, because he was a Guild socialist and he was a Christian socialist, just like Polanyi. Although utterly unlike Polanyi, Gill's name is now mud following the revelations of, his incest with his sister, and he sexually abused two of his daughters and their pet dog, and so on and so forth. Anyway, design was so it was Penguin was aimed for mass market working people. The penguin image was part of it, part of this. It was very striking. The aim was to find a kind of brand mascot that was dignified but fun, And Alan Lane's secretary, Joan Coles, she suggested the penguin would capture those two elements, dignified but fun. You've probably seen it on old Penguin books. It's a cartoonish little thing. Again, the aim was to connect to a mass market. Penguins in the 1930s were becoming popular. There was a lot of buzz around the new penguin pond at London Zoo and so on. Now, more politically, if I can move on to that, for the left at the time, this arrival of Penguin was seen as quite a big deal. The Penguin paperbacks seemed to signify that a new level of mass education was arriving, and this would enable democracy to expand and deepen. The Penguin sixpennies were the beginnings. I'm quoting Margaret Cole. She said the Penguin sixpennies were the beginnings of a real revolution. They were helping a vast new public come into being, from out of those who'd been poorly educated or otherwise alienated from high quality fiction and nonfiction alike. Polanyi was probably a friend of hers, by the way. I mean, he doesn't, as far as I can recall from digging around in the archives, uh, I don't recall he mentioned her, but he probably did. He was certainly a friend of her husband, GDH Cole, and definitely, of course, he shared her belief that workers' education would be and was a major driver of the shift toward socialism, a shift that hopefully would be the culmination of the great transformation that the world was going through in the course of the mid-20th century, the subject of his book. And now the great transformation, of course, did not take place. And Penguin Books, far from being a herald of socialism, turned out to have been really just a pioneer of branded mass production. Or if you want to put it in the kindest possible way, I've seen somebody describe the Penguin Project as optimistic social democratic consumerism. And since those heady social democratic days, following various mergers and acquisitions, Penguin is now Penguin Random House, the world's largest publisher of books. And Penguin Random House, in turn, belongs to the Bertelsmann Empire, which is famous for its evangelical roots and its obscene part in the Nazi project, and more recently, its shitty little TV station RTL. That, of course, doesn't mean that Penguin now publishes only and Pap. In fact, I was at Exeter St. David's Station where the whole thing began just this morning. And I noticed there that Penguin have set up a books vending machine for the rushed consumers, to just put a fiver in and get a book out. Or a tenner probably. It includes some of the crap by, I don't know, Richard Osman and a few tedious self-improvement books, but also novels by Elif Shafak, nonfiction by Naomi Klein, and that brilliant book on the transgender issue, I forget its name, by Sean Fay. It includes some of the golden oldies by Garcia Marquez, Truman Capote, Ken Kesey, and lots of other good stuff. Unfortunately, it wasn't. This was my hope when I went to look at the vending machine, but in vain. It was not selling the book that we're gathered here to celebrate today, namely Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. Although the editors at Penguin reassure me again in an email today that it's doing very well indeed. The book got off to this new edition got off to a fast start thanks to an article in the Observer newspaper, which had about 500,000 views. That propelled the book to #1 on Amazon's movers and shakers list, and there have been 3 reprints already. Hannah, who I mentioned earlier from Penguin, she wrote me saying we've sold over 7,000 copies to date, which is huge for a modern classic. Well, yeah, this is in their modern classic series. It's huge for a modern classic in its first few months. How very different then, as Margie alluded to earlier, how very different to the story of its only previous publication in Britain, which was by Victor Gollancz in 1945. By the way, in that Observer article that I mentioned, a Penguin spokesperson said that this new one is the only British edition, which is definitely not true for, well, partly, Penguin is now owned by Bertelsmann and it's headquartered in New York. So how British this edition is, well, that's up for discussion. But also more seriously, because of the Gollancz edition in 1945. Anyway, following that publication in 45, as well as the one a year earlier in the US, Great Transformation really occupied a pretty marginal role for quite some decades. Anthropologists knew about it and a few others, but it wasn't all that well known. It was with neoliberalism in the 1980s that began to change. And in recent years, its reputation has grown further. If you look at Google's Ngram viewer, you can see that citations of Karl Polanyi grew rapidly. Well, they grew very slowly in the post-war decades, then quite rapidly in the 80s. But over the last 10 or 20 years, the pace has picked up even more. So the question one might ask is, what explains the changing fortunes of this book? And I don't claim to have a rounded answer to that, but I'll sketch out for you my thoughts. And I'd be interested to hear the others' takes on this as well. I mean, first of all, I'd say, why was it relatively neglected in the post-war period? Well, I'm sure there are lots of reasons. One that I notice is that a central claim of the book is that state intervention destabilizes market economies, and that claim was refuted during the 50s and through into the 70s. Some very regulated and statist forms of market economy grew very rapidly. That phase of capitalism was more stable, not less. But then in the following phase of globalized neoliberalism, the echoes of the 19th century market liberalism that Polanyi blazes against in the Great Transformation. They're everywhere to see, the sort of market fundamentalism, if you like. And so Polanyi's critique suddenly becomes more vivid in a sense, relating to what we see around us more clearly. Since the But then, since the 2008 financial crisis, and then after the COVID pandemic, neoliberal, and with geopolitical changes that I'll come on to, neoliberalism is no longer so manifest, let's say, or no longer seems so secure, at least ideologically. We've been seeing the return of industrial policy, tariffs, protectionism, trade wars. The WTO is effectively defunct. exaggerating a little, but it's, um, and so if the Great Transformation were only really finding a readership thanks to its critique of neoliberalism, you would expect its influence to be, maybe falling at the moment, or at least not rising. But the truth is, it's really gaining readership more and more, and that demands an explanation. I think I sketched out some arguments in the introduction to this new edition. But as I said, I'll be very happy to hear alternative ideas. I mean, the argument I put forward in the introduction is that our current era, or what strikes me anyway, is that our current era is in very meaningful ways reminiscent of the age in which Polanyi himself grew up, in many ways, but at least three. Firstly, world order was back then in the late 19th century was shifting from British hegemony toward multipolar competition. I mean, Britain was losing its position faster than America is today, but nonetheless, I think there's some analogy there, I think. Secondly, market liberalism was dominant in Britain and its allies and across much of the world, including Austria-Hungary, where Polanyi grew up. But given the staggering and increasing levels of inequality and insecurity, that new liberal order was provoking conservative and authoritarian, so-called populist backlashes, as well as protectionism. And again, I think the comparison with the present day is pretty striking. And thirdly, back then, in the late 19th century in Austria-Hungary, social anxieties were being channeled xenophobically against immigrants, against Jews. There was an upsurge of conspiracy theories, blood and soil nationalism, fascism, proto-fascism, if you like. Again, the comparison to the present is obvious, although, of course, a particular type of Jew, the Zionist type, has been accepted by establishment forces and by increasing numbers of fascists as well, while the Muslims, particularly the Palestinians, are in a sense, the new Jews. Their role is to be deported, victimized, crushed, and in Palestine exterminated. I mean, we were just discussing this before the meeting. I mean, by establishment forces, in the case of Palestine, I'm thinking especially of the American government. I mean, who would have predicted back in the 90s when liberal globalization was all the rage, that in the 2024 US presidential election, the contest would be between two outright pro-genocide candidates, with any anti-genocide candidates having no hope at all of winning the presidency. Polanyi, of course, was an anti-Zionist, though I don't know much about this. If anyone knows more, I'd be interested in hearing more. He was certainly no great friend of Israel. I think he opposed its formation, although he was troublingly close to the Soviet Union at the time, and the Soviet Union supported Israel's foundation for realpolitik reasons. It was the Soviets were looking for an ally in the Middle East to press their claims in the region against those states aligned with Britain, France, America, and so on. But certainly I think we can. I mean, it's a game one can play. What would Polanyi have thought? But it's pretty clear he would have been horrified by the way in which Israel has become dominated by fascism in government, and almost a population of fascists is hardly an exaggeration. Polanyi's own life was affected very directly by the developments that I described. He was expelled from Budapest University for having stood up to attack by anti-Semites. He stupidly signed up for military service, was sucked into all the horrors of the First World War, and spat out again. Then he was exiled to Vienna because Hungary was going proto-fascist really under Miklos Horthy. Then in the early 1920s, his situation improved thanks to the arrival of Ilona and Kari, thanks to Red Vienna above all, perhaps, well, not above all, but in a very different dimension. Thanks to his employment. This is 100 years ago this year. It was when was when Polanyi started as a journalist on the Österreichische Volkswirt. And it was in 1924 as well. He set up his seminar on guild socialism, but then fascism a few years later struck again, forced him into exile, this time to Britain, just some of the time he was here, just 10-minute cycle down the road from me. Britain during the Great Depression, then the Second World War, he lost friends and family, including close relatives murdered in the Holocaust. And finally, over in America, fascists struck yet again. This time it was ultimately, in a sense, it was the Ku Klux Klan that led to the legislation that barred Ilona, his wife, from joining him, forcing her to live across the border in Canada, which ultimately is why this meeting is being hosted from there. Um, it's worth recalling, I think, then that the Great Transformation is only partly a critique of market liberalism. The argument is really, in a sense, about how the blowback from market liberalism is a breeding ground for fascism. Because before the First World War, the prognosis for liberals, such as Polanyi's parents, left liberals, if you like, was that economic globalization tends to bring prosperity and peace. But instead, 1914, it had brought war. Then 1930s, economic collapse, fascism, more war. And it was grappling with this puzzle, I suppose, that the Great Transformation began to take shape. Could these world wars, fascism, Great Depression, all have been symptoms of a crisis of liberal civilization? The events through which Polanyi and his generation were living certainly seemed to form an interconnected cataclysm, the origins of which, he argued, could be traced to the attempt to set up a self-regulating market system, which could not really exist, a utopia in that sense. And maybe it's the sense that we're living through a kind of market-driven cataclysmic blowback from market society. Perhaps that explains Polanyi's popularity today, resurgent as it is. I mean, certainly the social pathologies that seem everywhere today, from staggering, stupefying levels of social inequality to geopolitical volatility to virulent nationalism and to the level of conspiracy fantasies. All of these are reminiscent of developments he analyzed or he was facing in his life and analyzing in the Great Transformation. Recently, we've been seeing fascists enter government from Brazil to India. I mentioned Israel, but also Italy and many others. Uh, yeah, and above all, obviously something that Polanyi did not write about, but the threat posed by climate breakdown sort of dominates the horizon, looming down on all of these, in a sense, more minor mini cataclysms, painful though they all are. So, you know, in Polanyi's time, he was writing his book at, what Victor Serge called midnight in the century, the early 1940s, when fascism was increasing its hold over Europe, and uh, he was able to foresee dramatic changes in global order. Didn't work out in the way that he hoped. Nowadays, again, we're again seem to be at a state where, or at a condition where dramatic changes no longer seem so far-fetched. I'm a little hesitant, as I'm not going to be optimistic about them, I have to say, but certainly uh, we can all agree, I'm sure we live in interesting times, and as always, it's useful to pick up a copy of Polanyi's book, now available in this lovely covered new edition. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to hearing your thoughts on some of these issues.
Okay. I'm going to do the unthinkable, and that is rather than go to the chat, and then one of us has to read your questions, unless you're all going to converge. Uh, I would rather, and I think Gareth would probably prefer also that you simply ask, raise your hand. We can see hand raises, and then you can open your mics and ask your questions orally. Do you not agree that that's a better way to go than reading chats by a third party? So thank you, Gareth. Thank you for broad sweep of why the Great Transformation was written at the time, its resonance with today, and I believe, sadly, tomorrow, because the future doesn't look very different than what we're living through today, and that is if our planet manages to survive. I think what's interesting, just to make a quick comment, is the interest by environmentalists, including environmental economists and ecologists and people working on sustainable development, name it as you will, in Polanyi. That's also accelerated tremendously over the years. I see that Chris Millett is with us, and I'll just mention one of the projects that we've been working on now for a couple of years, and that is a very substantive annotated bibliography of references to Polanyi. And we will be launching this platform imminently. It's been almost ready to launch for quite some time, but it looks like we might be lucky and launch it before the end of this year. And I mention that because it's you can search by discipline, and there's or by theme, and there's quite a number of substantive references as opposed to just simply a footnote or a bibliographic reference to Polanyi. So there, in the accelerated interest in Polanyi, that is one area that has grown significantly, and not surprisingly, because it too is a result of, in many ways, market fundamentalism. So the floor is open to questions, and I see Ernst Hollander has a question, and sometimes if I see only your video, I can't I don't see your name. So maybe what those of you who are going to ask questions can perhaps just briefly turn off your video so I see who you are and I introduce you appropriately. Okay, Ernst, welcome.
Thank you so much. You have to bear with me if I'm a bit nervous because I think this society is so great, so I can. But anyhow, I'll talk a bit from my Swedish vantage point, and I think there are some interesting relations explaining maybe. One is the onslaught on reciprocity that has been taken place, and maybe this could explain in Sweden why social democracy has been so vulnerable to the attacks and the very big transformation that's taken place. I mean, we don't formally have a fascist party in the government, but it's a fundamental part of the majority in Sweden, and this very rapid moving away from the social model, and one could argue, and I've done that many times, that the Nordic countries had sort of unconsciously been very influenced by Polanyian thinking for instance, by the very strong role in the Nordic countries of popular movements. It's not exactly Red Vienna, but at the same time we had this very strong popular movements where there has been a lot of reciprocity, but then the social democratic state has been more and more counter to this to those movements, really made them very bureaucratic. And in this way, I think there is a revival of interest in how reciprocity and things coming up from below could be a way of reinforcing the we'll say reinforcing the forces of the left, but in another way than earlier. So this is one way in which maybe Swedish experiences could inform why this. And then there is one other that I want to point to, and that is that there are a number of areas in Sweden, in the health, education, welfare, etc., areas where Polanyi couldn't even think of. It was they were so far away from being. They were so far away from being becoming fictitious commodities. But in Sweden, in fact, we have this development that you've had a number of new areas where dominated by marketization and then becoming capital. So this is another tendency. So those are two things informing the question you posed from a Swedish perspective, let's say. Okay, thank you. Sorry for being so long.
Okay, thank you. Gareth, do you want to comment or move on?
I think it's probably better with an audience such as this to group
Okay,
questions and
we'll take a few and
contributions.
then
I can just come in later.
okay, so we can take a few. Francisco, Paco, please.
Hi.
Hi. You can just...
Very interesting times. I see that what calls my attention more than anything else is the scientific phenomenon, which is a crisis of reductionism. Our capacity of representation is in crisis, and the efforts that have proceeded in order to gain an understanding that was closer to reality as a consequence of this are gaining enormous influence. And I certainly think that the Great Transformation is influential because of this main reason. I also think that the transformations that are happening today are highly induced by enormously powerful technological transformations. I'm preparing a conference now on artificial intelligence and social technical transformations. And the interest of Karl Polanyi on technology, I think, is something that hasn't been mentioned, but I think is also of great significance to the reason why his work is gaining enormous interest. We did, Gareth has mentioned COVID. The fact that state intervention and the crisis of globalism are based on market hegemony has become so apparent. When we had to forbid planes from flying in the air so that we could survive, and demonstrated this enormous ability to regulate society in order to find the future, I think also brings ideas that establish a new relationship between state intervention and the markets as being highly meaningful. But I wanted to mention a little bit about Southern Europe, because it's changing. the hegemonic discourse in Europe is changing. The leader of the Second International is the president of Spain. Spain has a coalition government which is a left-wing government. Okay, we also have the problems of Italy and Greece, but what we're seeing is that in terms of economic performance, the hegemony of Northern Europe is being questioned. And I think that in spite of the fact that all this is hindered by the fact that there is a relationship with dictatorship and authoritarianism, which needs to be overcome, socially, the mentality is changing. And I think this is going to favor, in the long term, a closer relationship within Europe. Because the old idea of some countries having to follow others is somewhat in crisis. So I think that the effort that Polanyi does to understand the world in its own terms and not in terms of hegemony, I think becomes very relevant. So this is just a series of my own reflections on what is being talked about.
Okay. Thank you. Pedar Kirby.
Good evening to you all. Lovely to be with you. And Gareth, thank you very much for that very interesting sort of embedding of Polanyi in the history of Penguin. That was all news to me. I just wanted to reflect on a few elements that to me are important in understanding why Polanyi didn't take off until the neoliberal era. And one of them, and I'm wondering what your response to this is the way in which dominant approaches in the left became very much dominated by statist approaches. I mean, there was a space there certainly in the post-Second World War period for a more democratic reading of socialism. But it's interesting that Polanyi really, up until the late 1980s, early 1990s, didn't begin to fill that space. And my argument would be because our approaches, including social democratic approaches, put much more emphasis upon the role of the state rather than the role of society. And that comes back to Ernest's points about reciprocity. It seems to me it's only now in the era of climate change where we're beginning to face the reality of local communities having to be much more self-provisioning. Certainly that's the direction that I see us going. And therefore, the themes and the principles of reciprocity suddenly becoming much more interesting. I know from my own personal point of view, reading Polanyi on reciprocity opens my eyes to the potential of living even in the community that I live in. So I'm just wondering if you feel there's anything to that. And thank you very much for your talk today. Fascinating.
Gareth, those are three comments, three questions. There's two more. Would you like to perhaps intervene now?
Okay. Yeah, why not?
And then we'll go on to the next two.
These are all great questions,
Yeah.
and I don't have all that much to say. Margie began by mentioning interest in Polanyi from environmentalists, and Penguin have told me that one of the first people to reach out to them asking for a copy of the book was Carolyn Lucas, who's one of the best-known environmentalists here in Britain. So that would support what Margie is saying there. More generally, I think I'm sure people are doing this, but I'm not sure who. But there's work to be done on Polanyi's environmentalism. Is there an what sort of environmental critique is there in Polanyi? I wrote an awful lot on Polanyi, but didn't write a great deal on environmental questions. I mean, Marxists have done a lot of digging in Marx's work to reveal how one-sided the traditional appraisals of Marx have been on questions of the environment. The last 25 years has seen an absolute sea change in the way that Marx is regarded on environmentalism. There's been a huge amount of scholarly work on this. I'm not sure what's going on with Polanyi in that regard. It's something I'd be really interested to hear more about. I did keep an eye. I mean, I am an environmentalist and pretty much always have been, so I kept an eye out for this kind of question when I was doing archival research on Polanyi, but I didn't really find too much and didn't write too much on it, but it would be interested to hear. Ernst Hollander's point about social democratic governments clamping down on social movements and on all kinds of forms of reciprocity bureaucratically. Yeah. So Peter's point is that dominant approaches on the left were statist in the post-war period. Polanyi was a statist in some respects. He was very friendly for quite a while towards the Soviet Union. He was quite close to Fabianism and various Fabians for a while. So he's not, he's not, well, in certain phases he was an anarchist, of course, but early in life. And not for long. So he knew he could be a bit of a statist too, but I think Peter's right that his emphasis is always on society as a more diverse aggregate of social movements and churches and trade unions and so on. And so I think Peter's point is therefore convincing, and one could link it, as I think he did, to Ernst, that once we have seen social democratic regimes in charge for 2 or 3 decades, they increasingly reaction occurs against their bureaucratic ethos, and simply they tend to grow more divorced from the social movements, above all the labor movement that initially animates them in their early phases. That's certainly what happened to social democracy. And so as its star faded in the 1970s and 80s, the dominant critique was that of the neoliberals, but at the same time, one could see space on the left for critiques or alternatives such as the Polanyian one coming about, and that does seem to be what happened. Francisco asks whether Polanyi sought to understand the world in its own terms, not in terms of hegemony. Well, Polanyi did write about hegemony. I mean, hegemony gets used in lots of different ways. He certainly wrote about hegemony in terms of the various nationalities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he didn't relate much to Gramsci, from whose work the sort of dominant academic interpretation of hegemony has come. Although Lenin wrote on hegemony as well. Again, Polanyi didn't engage much with Lenin. So no, yes, I see what you mean. I think, Francisco, as to your faith that Northern Europe's hegemony within the EU is declining, I just don't see the evidence for that. But I'd be happy to look at any arguments or evidence as to why that might be taking place. I mean, certainly Germany's economic model is in crisis. It's based around the auto industry to quite a large extent, which hasn't responded to despite the presence of the German Greens in the German political class, very essentially, the German economy the German car industry hasn't responded to the need to transition to electric vehicles very effectively and is feeling the heat from China. So yeah, I can see that, economically Germany is stuttering a bit. But I don't share your view that spells a very different relationship between Northern Europe and the South. Anyway, yeah, that's all. They're my remarks on the comments, but they were all interesting points. Thanks very much.
Okay. Andy Golner, Andras Golner. Andy, do you hear me? Your hand is raised. You need to unmute if you want to ask a question. There you go.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Yes.
Sorry, Gareth, lovely to see you. Delighted to hear about the new edition. And I just have a very quick question, and I have to apologize. I'll have to leave in about 10 minutes because I'm due for a COVID shot. So here's the question. What is your explanation? I ran across it once earlier, but I'm a little fuzzy about it, as to why Polanyi is so silent, we can even use the word silent, about capital as opposed to market, subsequent to the publication of The Great Transformation. Capitalism, of course, transformed the mechanism of the market from an embedded one into a disembedded one. Why was Polanyi's attention almost exclusively on the market mechanism subsequent to 1945, rather than on its, how should I say, genetic seed, which is capitalism? What's the explanation for that?
Gareth, I'm going to ask you to answer this question because he has to leave.
Oh.
He has to get a COVID shot. Okay.
Okay, well, good luck with your COVID shot. I'm glad we're not meeting tomorrow, or you'd have to stagger to the screen. Anyway, why was Polanyi silent about capital as opposed to markets subsequent to the publication of Great Transformation? I mean, yeah, Polanyi, in my reading, had his particularly leftist phases. Oh, it's hard, from around. He's an interesting part of why I find him so engaging to research was because he's quite hard to pin down on these sorts of questions. But in his Guild Socialist phase, sort of, what was it, 1918 to 25 or something. And in the Red Vienna phase, where he was engaging with the Austro-Marxists to quite some extent, and just with the external environment of a labor movement in a very optimistic mood for a few years. I think that was a particularly leftist phase. In some other ways, he was very leftist in the 1930s. The opposition to taking the Republican side against fascism in the Spanish Civil War and so on, and just the threat of fascism, which was so visceral and personal for Polanyi, as I mentioned earlier. That was also a phase where he grew quite close to the Communist Party, which was a very militant party, but also on sort of tied to Moscow in unfortunate ways at the same time. So he was using the language of the Marxist left to some extent. I mean, he was deeply influenced by Marx in the 1930s as well. Why he then shifted away and got rid of most of the talk of capitalism and focused on market economy. I mean, there are different theories. Some people talk about McCarthyism. I don't think that can have been all of it. He was moving out of that social movement and activist arena into the ivory tower of the university. much more, and that can be that can tend to smother one's critical instincts to some extent, or they shrivel in that environment rather more. He in the 1930s, he was very active on the Christian left, and but also he didn't have a dialectical approach to social change or understanding society. He wasn't a dialectical thinker, and the concept of capital. I mean, for those who don't know my work, I'm fascinated by Polanyi, but I'm a Marxist. I find the concept of capital is central to understanding the world we live in, and a great absence in Polanyi's work is the absence of discussion of capital. Uh, with all that implies, I won't elaborate on that point any further. I'll just leave it hanging there as a kind of shorthand answer to Andras. So yeah, a few ideas there, Andras. I must confess I haven't done any work on Polanyi for I don't know, 9 years or 8 years or so. So I'm a little rusty on those sorts of questions. I think I have written at greater length on your question, but that'll do for now.
Thank you. Ken Matsiorinis, please.
Hello, everyone. Gareth, thank you for speaking today, and thank you for doing the work along with Margie and Anna in republishing Karl Polanyi's work. I don't have a question, just a few observations, a comment. Karl Polanyi, for me, the Great Transformation for me was one of the most important books I've read. And I enjoyed it thoroughly because it combined the economic dimensions with political, social change, trying to understand the structure of the changes taking place. At the time, the old order of Alfred Marshall, of Britannia ruling the world, First World War, the collapse that followed, the irony of the globalization of the time that had reached its peak before World War I and then led to the war, and then the complete bloodbath and collapse that followed, was a period of great transformation for humanity and for the world economy. Today, we see a lot of parallels, and I think it has a lot of relevance for people who are trying to understand the changes that are taking place. The left and the right, at least in the political arena, have ceased to be different. Right-wing governments are pursuing statist policies. Left-wing governments are following conservative right-wing policies, and there's a lot of change that cannot be explained in a very simple way, and the mainstream economic profession has done a poor job in deciphering and explaining, accounting for what we're going through. So it left a big mark on me because I'm more of a holist. Want to see things from all the social science dimensions, not just pure economic, separated from moral or political or social or even religious factor. So I'm very excited with the new edition. I'm going to go and buy it and read your introduction, which I haven't had the chance to read. And I thank you very much for hosting the seminar today.
Thank you. I see that Francisco's raised his hand again, but before I take your question or comment, is there anyone else that would like to intervene? Any questions or comments? Okay, Paco, go ahead.
The balance of power in Europe has not changed significantly. I agree with that. But there are trends that I think are very, very meaningful. And they have to do with things that are very physical, which is the geopolitical problem that Germany has with the dependency on Russian gas, and the fact that sunny Spain has an enormous ability to tap renewables. It's going to be about 50% of the energy supply. And this is very important economically and in terms of long-term sustainability. I don't think that we can see this yet because the deployment is in process and there's a lot of problems. I'm not going to bore you with them in terms of reorganizing the energy sector in Spain. But the foreign affairs person in Europe is Borrell, Spanish socialist. And the main person who has risen in the environment was the ex-minister of the environment of Spain. So I think that there are trends in terms of the influence within the political and bureaucratic power within the European Union, which do signify changes in relationships of hegemony. I don't mean that this was necessarily something that was very directly spoken about by Karl, but his interest in, for example, in indigenous markets and his very broad and brave anthropological interest really through the Eurocentric social sciences part. So I think that there is in his work a very open mind in terms of understanding social reality and the world. And I think that changes are happening and they're very significant inside of Europe. Although this doesn't mean that my optimism is going to be justified or it's going to be the future, because certainly the struggle between different ideologies are very powerful. But the Northern European vision, in terms of how it's been organized in France or in Britain or in Germany, doesn't seem to be very long-term in its vision. And I think that's a weakness. Sorry to be so long.
Any comment or response?
Yeah, I can respond briefly to those 2 points. To Ken's point, all very interesting. I wonder how new it is that left and right-wing governments can be quite similar. I mean, in my country, in Britain, the Attlee government in the 1940s was a Labour government that called in the military to break strikes, and then Conservative governments shortly afterwards built lots of council houses as well. I mean, probably fewer than Labour, but there were and of course um, would also happily have called in the military in similar circumstances. But yeah, this is certainly something I would agree with you is very noticeable that and as I would understand it, capitalist relations constrain capitalist states in very powerful ways, left or right. As to Francisco's point, just very briefly, yeah, I mean, maybe you're right that solar energy will give Spain an edge, but it's been investing in solar for a very long time, and this hasn't made any difference to its GDP figures. If you look at GDP for Spain and Germany since 2008, Spanish GDP has fallen. It's lower than it was at that time. Germany's has risen quite substantially. So maybe in the long run, your arguments will have purchase, but in the last 10, 20 years, that hasn't been a noticeable feature of European economy.
Ernst. Okay, Ernst, and then Peggy Summers. So we'll take 2 questions.
Okay, thank you. I want to suggest a relation between Polanyi and the environment in a quite roundabout way that I tried to pursue earlier at some conferences, and that is what I would call it the neoliberalism economic unsustainability or unsustainability nexus. And my idea is that Polanyi can go a good way to explain in what way social sustainability and as in Swedish case the people's trust in each other has been going down very rapidly as a consequence of neoliberal changes, and that in turn undermines the possibility to pursue an ecological sustainable economy, because you need to believe that I need to believe that my neighbors will also accept changes in lifestyle, other kinds of consumption, other kinds of lives. If I am going to do it, it's the advantages are long term, but the changes are hurting short term. So this way of through what I don't know what one should call it, but sort of social psychological mechanisms that do undermine the possibility to do the ecological climate transformations that are so necessary. So this is a way of using what I would can call a Polanyian framework to understand why, in fact, the possibilities for transformations, environmental climate transformations, are very much reduced. So again, bear with me for being too long. And I just want to add before finishing that I also enjoyed the talk, the first talk, as well as your books, etc. Gareth, very, very much. Okay, thank you.
Margaret Summers, Peggy?
Yeah, sorry about the sun.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I know I hope it makes me look appropriately angelic. But first, I just want to congratulate you, Gareth. I think it's a fabulous achievement. that you did this and that it's done with Penguin. I loved the Penguin story in the beginning. I didn't know that story at all. And I predict it's just a matter of time till you can pop a fiver or tenner into that vending machine and out will pop uh, how to make socialism, thanks to Karl Polanyi. So, but I wanted to ask you about the cover. The cover is spectacular. It's a beautiful painting, and if you could say something about it. That's my first comment or question. The second is kind of just a warning. I'm not sure. I don't see a lot of Americans on this meeting, so many of you may not be familiar with a very foreboding use of Polanyi that is currently in vogue. We have an American neo-fascist, a homegrown American neo-fascist movement in this country, which is the right-wing Catholicism that is driving J.D. Vance. And it's being funded by Peter Thiel, the gazillionaire Silicon Valley guy who bought J.D. Vance's. Well, just to remind you, Vance is the current Republican vice presidential candidate, and if Trump wins, and given his health, possible president, Vance is a right-wing converted Catholic, and this Catholic movement is driven by a very complex combination of left-wing social democracy. That's why many Republicans are now calling themselves the Workers' Party, and right-wing Opus Dei influenced cultural politics, which is essentially represented in what those of you who've heard of Project 2025. And two of the leading figures in this movement, one is called Deneen, Patrick Deneen, Deneen. He's a professor at Notre Dame, the Catholic University. And his first book read like a Polanyian tract. They cite Polanyi everywhere. And his new book, Regime Change, these are fascist tracts, but based on a social democratic appeal to state intervention. The second book is called Tyranny, Inc. by Sohrab Armari, who's an Iranian American who used to write for the Wall Street Journal and used to be a Trotskyist, apparently, so he claims. I have my doubts. Who had a conversion. And his book, Tyranny, Inc., reads like a Marxist book. And if you didn't know that he was a neo-fascist, but the book Polanyi probably has more citations in this book than anybody else, other than Marx. And it's a scary movement. They're very influential, and there's a lot of big money behind them, and they are the brains behind J.D. Vance and Project 2025. And it is very creepy that Polanyi has become their intellectual reference point. And I don't know if you're familiar at all with this, Gareth. I doubt very many people are. I've only really become cognizant of it in the last 6 months or so.
Am I audible? I briefly turned off my camera because I was hunting for the book because Peggy was talking about the cover, which I'm holding up now. Oh, Margie's got a copy as well. So first of all, in answer to Peggy's question about and thanks for the congratulations, but in answer to the question about the cover, I shared your reaction exactly, Peggy. In fact, well, actually, it was a little more complex because Penguin originally had a very different cover, which was also brilliant, but much more abstract. I loved it. But then for some reason, copyright, blah, blah, something, they couldn't use it. I forget exactly why. And they came up with this one instead, which is even better. It's just so the great transformation. The era which it evokes, the sort of big questions with the hand pointing towards the past and the future and so on, is just perfect for the great transformation. The industry and uh, yeah. Um, and also that it's a painting by Erno Goldfinger, who was a Hungarian who moved to Britain again, is neat, given Polanyi, who he was, etc. So yeah, I shared your love of the cover. I think it's just perfect for it. Well done, Penguin.
Yeah. When was the painting done?
Oh, now you're asking.
See, I'm looking.
Cover artwork. Even better, 1943.
Oh
Oh,
my gosh. Oh my gosh.
very interesting.
And get this, it was a design for the London. I'm having to read this. I should be aware of it, but hadn't. It's a design for the London Women's Parliament exhibition
Oh my gosh.
in Piccadilly Circus in London. And yeah, 1943.
Oh, that
It's
is
perfect. So yeah, on Peggy's second point, yeah, I mean the increasing amount of fascist literature that really confidently draws on socialist theory and so on is pretty disturbing. And I'm aware of Project 2025. I'm not aware of the people that you discussed just now. I haven't been reading as much fascist literature as I really ought to. I'm very aware of it. But yeah, there's enough disgusting stuff I have to read each day that I've been avoiding those shelves to some extent. So I don't actually have much to add on what on Peggy's contribution just now. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, I'll leave it at that, but just very much share your concern at this stuff and your awareness that yeah, they're creeping around in all sorts of unexpected places. Um, Useful to read perhaps on one of those, not the one that you were talking about, Peggy, but one other um, set of threads that connect fascists to sections of the left is Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is the book that I mentioned at the top of my talk, which is being sold by Penguin in its Exeter St. David's Station vending machine.
yes.
Peggy, perhaps you could send it to me or to Anna, the titles of those dreadful books,
I'd be happy to.
that we have them, and if anybody wants to note them. I don't think it's bedside reading or even intellectual food. It's indigestible, but it's a real perversion of the use of Polanyi, Marx, socialist writings. It's really quite appalling and very disturbing, extremely disturbing. I just wanted to ask you if you don't mind. Chris Millett is with us. You don't have to speak, Chris. I'm not putting you on the spot. But regarding the point raised or the question raised by Gareth, who's scoured, I mean, I was there to see it, scoured the archive over many years, and suggesting that he did not necessarily see, or maybe you weren't looking for it, the connection to questions of the environment.
Oh, I didn't put it anything like as
No,
absolutely as
I didn't mean it that way.
yeah.
I meant that it was, it was not sort of the center of your focus. But I think it's interesting just Chris, do you have just on the top of your head, was I right to say that there's really an acceleration of interest on the part of environmentalists over, let's say, the last 10 years or so? If you're there, answer. If you've if your name is just there and you're muted and you're away, that's okay. We can check. But I think it's an interesting point, and it's something we can send you, Gareth, it's just out of interest, not to ask you to start writing another book by any means.
Hi everybody. I'm here, but my video isn't working. I'm actually at the Karl Polanyi Institute at Concordia today. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you can all hear me,
Yes, we can.
but I would be happy to provide a list of resources that have come out recently, because there, as Margie's saying, there definitely seems to be an acceleration in at least journal articles that are published that are using Polanyi's concepts to tackle questions around climate politics, and it's probably worth looking further into how exactly they're applying Polanyi in those cases.
So we can provide that. We have that information. And as I mentioned earlier, the annotated bibliography platform will be launched hopefully before the end of this year, if not early in the new year. Well, our time is just about up, and well, first of all, thank you so much, Gareth, for being with us for 90 minutes. It's what, 7:30? It's not that late in the UK. It's time. You can have a glass.
It's 7:30. Yeah, I can toast to the new edition.
You can toast. I mean, we can all toast the new edition of The Great Transformation, toast your excellent introduction to it and all the work that you have done over the last 16, 17 years. It's been really a pleasure to have you around, physically for a long time, and to have you as a member of the executive committee. So thanks so much for today, and cheers everyone. And I have two more things I wanted to say. One is Carrie Polanyi Levitt. It's difficult for Carrie increasingly to be present and follow everything and be able to intervene and ask questions. She's much more at ease listening to a recording, where she can replay what she didn't hear clearly. And so in general, Zooms are more of a challenge for her. But I should also add that she had a music lesson this afternoon. So we'll find out. I don't know what that's all about. I'll find that out, but she's extraordinary. And I know that she's been hard at work, working on new things that she's writing with the help of assistance. So she continues to be really quite remarkable in all respects. And then I was going to mention one more thing, and I remember when I stopped teaching that one of the things I said to myself in the last year was never start with the students telling them you have three things to say. You should just say whatever it is that's on your mind, and not enumerate. So there was one other item I wanted to raise with you all, but now honestly it's gone. So we'll leave it at that. You can order the book online. I don't know if there was a special rate at one point. I don't know if that still applies, but it's shipped to Canada. It's shipped, I think, all over the world. So if you want a fresh copy, although I've scribbled all over your introduction, so mine is starting to look a little bit like my other copies. I wish you all the best. These are, Gareth and I were talking earlier, and these are interesting times. I can't even use that phrase. These are horrendous times. And it would be, one can imagine if Polanyi were part of this conversation, his shock, but I would strongly feel that his analysis really would not change. The terms, perhaps, the vocabulary, perhaps, but the phenomenon that's out there, the ugliness, the evil, the difficulty of displacing power, regardless of how consequential the actions are, political actions, economic actions. It is very difficult to unseat power, as we know, and then of course the situation that you sensitively raised in Gaza. The ongoing genocide is something that we deplore, openly deplore, and I know that Carrie for sure, and I could not imagine Karl Polanyi not sharing these sentiments. So, oh yes, now I remembered. I guess you have to go into despair before you can jog your memory. I don't know if we haven't put this up yet on our website or on any of the social media. I spent a little under a week in Lille in France, and there is now an amphitheater in the university that has been named after Karl Polanyi. And it's a large amphitheater, and there's a huge sign outside, Amphithéâtre Karl Polanyi, with the room number. And inside, there's a wonderful plaque with a photograph and a blurb, quite lengthy, and big print, so you can see it even if you're in the front row as a student. So I was there to open this this amphitheater, and it was really treated as a very big event. I mean, the university president, the dean, the heads of research departments. But what was extraordinary and so refreshing was that this research center is a research center of economists. These are, left economists. The students all have to read Polanyi. There are a lot of post-Keynesians. It's really so refreshing. I could never have imagined such an environment in an economics department anywhere else. So this amphitheater is in a good place, and I believe that they are very eager to host the next International Karl Polanyi conference in 2026. So stay tuned. That was what I almost forgot to add. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evenings, the rest of your days. And thank you again, Gareth. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And it's